or a translation that tries above all else to match the syntax as it might have been understood by the earliest readers of the book of Genesis, the alternative rendering has an advantage. So let's go on to verse 3. We're going to spend the shortest amount of time in verse 3. But verse 3 is we're introduced to the last image, or the last really word that we're going to look at, kind of key word, and that is light. That is, verse 3 just says, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. And light's going to be a very important word too. When you think of the contrasting light and darkness, again, think to the ministry of Jesus. Even when, I think, Jeremy, you referenced the meeting with Nicodemus this past Sunday. He comes to him at dark, and light and dark play a major theme throughout the whole Bible and throughout Jesus' ministry as well. But this phrasing, how you see this phrase, this structuring of the phrase, and God said, and then and there was, is going to play out as we look at the creation narrative. You're going to see, virtually what you're going to see is you're going to have God saying something or thinking a thought, like let there be something, and then God acts upon that thought and actually does the creating of. And that's important as we look at next week when we go into Genesis 1 and look at the creation narrative, the days of creation. But it also, when we compare this account, that creation account in Genesis 1 to other creation accounts of the day, we'll see that it follows somewhat of a similar order, but ultimately God proves to be more powerful. So again, you got to come next week if you want to hear about that. But we'll get to wrapping this up. And this is what it's going to look like. So I promised you we'd come back to it, and we're going to come back. We've looked at the micro view of each verse, and then we're going to bring it all back and put it in a macro view. But we've got two views at play right here. We've got our traditional view, and we've got our Hebrew syntax view. And you'll really see the only differences right here are we've got the word when right here, which I bolded, and then verse 2 is in parentheses, just based on the grammar that we looked at. And I understand that there are many different translations available for both of these views. I just didn't want to have 100 more slides on here going through each translation. But this is a good overall view of really how you can take the interpretation in the two views. So we're going to look at them in a little bit more detail at the macro level. And we're going to start with the traditional view because this is what we are most familiar with. So in the traditional view, you have, again, I'm not going to read all three verses again, but you really have a sequence of events. And again, I've color-coded these for a reason. What you see in yellow represents what is known as an independent clause. I know I'm making an English teacher out there somewhere smile, but an independent clause is just a complete thought. So it doesn't need any additional information accompanying it to make it complete. And so you have, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That can stand alone by itself. It doesn't need any additional information accompanying it to complete it. Verse 2, however, we looked at the and heavy language and the parentheses around it. Verse 2 is not complete. It needs something else to complete it. And in this traditional view, that is verse 3, God creating light. And so you essentially you've got a complete thought. So you've got verse 1 setting up the stage for verse 2, which sets up the stage for verse 3. So this is a linear sequence of events. In the beginning, God created, and this is what it looked like. And then from there, God created light. However, when we look at the Hebrew syntax view, there's one thing that changes. And this is why I say when we look at some of this stuff, this is why the first verse, how we interpret Genesis, can truly be really the cornerstone of the theological system that we hold and accept and believe. Here's the one difference in the Hebrew syntax view. Verse 1 becomes a dependent clause. It becomes an incomplete thought. It becomes something that needs additional information. So you have when God began to create the skies and the land, that can't stand alone by itself. It needs something else. And verse 2, just in the traditional view, verses 2 and 3 stay the same. Verse 2 remains incomplete in and of itself. And finally, we get to verse 3. And so in this view, verses 1 and 2 build up to verse 3. And verse 3 is the main idea or the independent standalone thought. And so in this view, what's happening is that the writer is describing conditions that already exist. Remember, we talked about no order and no purpose being nothingness. The writer is describing conditions that already exist before God actually creates anything or speaks anything into existence. So you've got verses 1 and 2 lead to verse 3, and verse 3 is actually the first creative act of Genesis. Whereas in the traditional view, God creating the heavens and the earth would be considered the first creative act, but verse 3, when light is created, that is the first creative act in the Hebrew syntax view. So, which interpretation is correct? And I hope there's a little bit of humor in why I chose the picture that I did. What came first? But it's an important question to ask. What interpretation should we choose? Or which one, not should we choose, because we can choose incorrect things, but which one is correct? So I'm going to offer you this. I brought this book with me right here, and I'm going to quote from it. I love it. I would recommend it. And the reason I'm quoting from this is because, one, it was written by two great scholars. One's actually a professor of law. But two, this is a translation of Genesis 1 through 11, and the translation that they give is right there, that little section. Everything else is commentary on those 11 chapters. And they present commentary in an unbiased way and just allow you as the reader, and they give you information and let you form your own opinion, let you chase down, let you explore more for yourself. So I'm going to quote from this commentary on Genesis 1, and this is shared by more than just them. I've read this from a number of people, but I think they word it best. And they are referencing verse 1 here, but I'm going to apply it to verses 1 through 3 because, again, that verse 1 is the one thing that changes. So here's what they say. The Hebrew can bear either the traditional rendering or the alternative. The alternative is the Hebrew syntax view that we looked at, where verse 3 is the first creative act. And they say this: the choice depends on translation philosophy. They go on to say, for a translation that tries above all else to match the syntax as it might have been understood by the earliest readers of the book of Genesis, the alternative rendering has an advantage. That'd be the Hebrew syntax view. They also offer this: for a translation that also considers how the text has been understood by more than 2 millennia of readers, Jewish and Christian, the advantage lies with the traditional rendering. So it all goes back to translation philosophy. But that doesn't really answer the question, which translation or which interpretation is correct. And just as Samuel Bray and John Hobbins have done, I will leave it open-ended as well. And I will see you next week for week 2. But I would encourage and invite and challenge us, each and every one of you, to go explore this for yourself.